السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another program of Gems of the Heart, where we look into our hearts and examine it and try and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify our hearts. And the hearts and how to purify it and how to work on it, it's something that is not left to our own desire, our own decisions, but rather it's the wahi, the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Something that we should be consistent in anything that we talk about. We have to refer back to the wahi, to the revelation from Allah, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. This is what we believe, this is what we act, this is how we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything we have to refer it back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of the hearts, and He's the one subhanahu wa ta'ala that ordered the believers on how to purify the hearts, and that is by being obedient to Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. These hearts, that for it to enter the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it has to be sound and pure heart. It's a subject that we keep on talking about it, and we should not ever be bored about talking about it, because within any time, even a split of a second, our hearts can be polluted with what we see, with what we hear. We're living as we are basically a sponge in whatever medium we put it in, and this is how the heart is. So we have to make sure that our hearts are constantly being examined, that we need to constantly purify our hearts, protect our hearts from what pollutes it. And this is basically the subject that we need to be concerned about. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us to have these hearts, to have the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he pointed at his heart and he said, At-taqwa ha-huna, At-taqwa ha-huna, At-taqwa ha-huna. At-taqwa, the fear of Allah, to be obedient to Allah, is here. It's here, it's here. 3 times the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam did so that we understand that the matter has to start from the heart. Once it's in the heart, then it shows in the speech and the actions of the individual. Otherwise, we are lying and stating that we are obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so on. We've been talking about the names and attributes of Allah, and how that these are means for us to purify our hearts. The purifier out of the hearts is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the way to purify our hearts is by returning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Ibadah, the worship of Allah, salah, fasting, giving zakah, making hajj, being kind to others, and so on and so forth, all of that are means to purify our hearts. But with the foundation of matters of faith, with the proper aqeedah, with the proper belief, and with matters of al-iman, this is the foundation for anything that is good to purify our hearts. And we've been talking about this from the aspect of matters of belief, and also the effect of these names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how it should purify our hearts. The more we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, the more our hearts will be purified from what? When we say purify our hearts, purify it from what? From disbelief, from associating partners with Allah, from arrogance, from envy, from whatever these types of evil sins, when it's present in the heart, that pollutes the hearts. So the more the person gets to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more the arrogance won't be there. All of these evil things won't be there, because a person get to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of the heavens and the earth. And one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is mentioned in the Quran is the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Muhaymen. The name Al-Muhaymen. What does that mean? What does this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means? How can it affect our hearts and purify our hearts? This is what we need to discuss in the few minutes that we're meeting here, so that we can really achieve the benefit of purifying our hearts with the names and attributes of Allah. This name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as we always learn, that the only way for us to know a name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is through the Quran and the authentic Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So when we say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of His names is Al-Muhaymen, is not something that we made up, but rather it's something that is mentioned in the Quran. And clearly in Surah Al-Hashr, the name is mentioned there with the other set of names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as we would hear in Surah Al-Hashr, verse number 23. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر سبحان الله عما يشركون. This last part of Surah Al-Hashr that talks about many of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and every name has an attribute with it. In this particular verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Hu Allah, it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one that there is no worthy of worship except Him. He is Al-Malik, He is the sovereign, He is Al-Quddus, the pure, He is As-Salam, the perfection, He's Al-Mu'min, the bestower of faith, and He is Al-Muhaymen. Al-Muhaymen meaning the overseer, and this is one of the meanings of Al-Muhaymen. The overseer over His creation, the one that witness, and the best of all witnesses, to witness for them of what is right and what is wrong and so on and so forth. And that the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in such a way that the one that has the knowledge, He is the one that is witnessing His creation with their actions. He's the one that is watching what they're doing, and He will reward them or punish them accordingly. That in the day of resurrection, nothing will be decreased from their good deeds, if they did good deeds, and nothing would increase of their sins in the day of judgment, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the overseer, He's the Muhaymen. Nothing will be dealt with any wrongdoing. Human beings, they can make mistakes. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of all things, He is Al-Muhaymen, no mistakes whatsoever, no deficiencies whatsoever. So comes with it the meaning of the most knowledgeable subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is no weight of a mustard seed in the heavens and the earth unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows about it. Because all of what's in the heavens and the earth, they are creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He created it. He created everything subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He is Al-Muhaymin. He is the one that oversees all things. He's the one that is all-knower of all things. He's the one that bestows His mercy over all things, and He protects them and He guides them and so on and so forth. And of course this has great effect if we would reflect really upon this meaning. One of the statements of, for example, Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah, he said, Al-Muhaymin is al-Musaddiq. Al-Muhaymin is the one that is mentioned the truth or states the truth of something. That He's the one subhanahu wa ta'ala that states that whatever you to follow is the truth. And this is with regards to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that this is the haqq, this is the truth. And it basically has, as some said, that it gives the meaning of the knowledge of all things, the absolute and the perfect power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to attain and to achieve everything by the will and the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the constant maintenance of all of what is benefiting and the affairs of the human beings and so on. All of that is only done by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He is Al-Muhaymin, the one that knows what's hidden and what's apparent. All of these things are not just words of mouth. It's something that the heart should constantly witness. Everything is known by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether it's hidden, whether it's apparent, whether it's physical or non-physical, whether it's the actions of the people, the conspiracies of the evildoers, the good deeds of those who are good doers, the ways of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on earth, who deserve what. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is overseeing over all things. When people start being in haste, why the situation of the ummah is like this, why is that? They suggest on certain things to happen, or they think that if it's going to be better if this or that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. He knows best subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's why everything is decreed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accordingly. So this is something that should have its effect and its clarity in the life of the believers, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muhaymin. We'll talk about the effect of that in our life, but the same attribute is mentioned with regards to the words of Allah, the Quran. And this is mentioned in Surah Al-Ma'idah. In Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse number 48, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He talked about the different books before the Quran, the Torah, the Injil, and how that these books are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and people altered them afterwards, and then mentioning the Quran, and mentioning something very unique and specific about the Quran in relations to the previous books, something that mentions in it the meaning of Al-Muhaymin. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the verse, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse number 48, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ مُصَدِّقًا لِمَا بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought down the book by the truth to the Prophet ﷺ after the previous books, لما بين يديه من الكتاب, giving or stating the truth of the books before. One of the ways to know that the books before are books of truth is because the Quran mentions them as book of truth, as they are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But so this is one of the things that the Quran do with regards to the previous books. But then وَمُهَيْمِنًا عَلَيْهِ. Muhayminan alayhi, that means it witnesses over the previous books. It affirms what's in it. It brings what's not in the previous books. So it abrogates all the revelation before, because it comes with whatever meanings that the human beings are in need of. From the previous revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's there in the Quran. And more for the human beings, whatever they need till the day of judgment, because the message of the Quran is such a universal one. The books before, the messengers before, they were sent specifically to their people, to whatever fits them and fits the time that they lived in and their environment that they're in. So the rulings and everything was very specific to them. The Quran, being the final revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is not revealed for specific individuals. It's not for the Arab, it's not for this or that, but it's for the entire humanity. Not just at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but it's true and it's valid till the day of judgment for all people. And that's the meaning of وَمُهَيْمِنًا عَلَيْهِ, that the Quran oversees all the previous books, witnesses for all of the previous books. It abrogates all the previous books by the final revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is a matter of belief, something that should be firm in the hearts of the believers. So therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهِ, judge and rule among them with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought down, which is in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَهُمْ, and do not follow their desires. Either you follow their desires or you follow the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ أَهْوَاءَهُمْ عَمَّا جَاءَكَ مِنَ الْحَقِّ, away from what came to you from the truth. لِكُلٍّ جَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا. To each and every nation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made a shir'ah, a way, a path. This is the sharia, the legislation and so on. وَمِنْهَاجًا, and a methodology. وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَجَعَلَكُمْ أُمَّةً وَاحِدًا. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will, He would have made you all one nation. وَلَكِنْ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ فِي مَا آتَاكُمْ. But rather, why didn't He make us all as one nation? So that He would test you with regards to what He gave you. فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ. That means race with one another, with matters of goodness. Don't just do good deeds, but rather race with other human beings. Be the best. When you race, you want to be the first. When you are in a race, you're not satisfied to be before last or the last. Why you are then in a race? You want to be the first. And this is what you aim for. This is what you do the best. And you get out of the best you have so that you are basically the first. فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ. We are in a race in this life to see who would do the best of all of the good deeds. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is overseeing. He's the one that is witnessing over our actions. Why? إِلَى اللَّهِ مَرْجِعُكُمْ جَمِيعًا. To Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala you return. Everyone, all of you shall return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَيُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِمَا كُنْتُمْ فِيهِ تَخْتَلِفُونَ. He would inform you of what used to differ among yourselves, whether it's with the previous nations and with the previous books and so on, or anything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, everybody shall return to Him. So as you see here in this verse, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stated clearly that the Quran oversees, witnesses for all of the previous revelations. The humanity does not need any of the previous revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the Quran, being the most comprehensive, the final revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And with the Quran, with the message of the Quran, that it really rectifies and makes those who are righteous, righteous, because it knows the human beings. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's inside of the human beings. And He knows what physical actions we are in need of to purify our insides and our hearts. And it's not left for us as individuals, as human beings, but rather to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we look at this and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us, and how this word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Muhaymen, and we'll talk about how this should affect our life. How should we live our life according to the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Muhaymen. But we need to make sure that the reality of it, the belief of it, is clear in our hearts. That this is one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Muhaymen. The one that is all witnessing over all things, the one that oversees all things. And you can see already by mentioning this, what is our duty then towards this proper belief in this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we see throughout the entire Quran how the effect of this belief in this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are in total submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing goes out of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made for His creation. Everything is being basically doing what has been created for. Throughout history, throughout the mankind, the journey of the mankind on the face of earth, the ways of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never changes. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows us in the Quran how that He subhanahu wa ta'ala overpowers all things and everything. If He decrees a matter, nobody can oppose this whatsoever. We know the story of Musa alayhi salam, how when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted good for the people of Bani Israel, He's the one subhanahu wa ta'ala that saved Musa alayhi salam from Fir'aun. And the matter could have been in all kinds of ways, that if Fir'aun is going around to take the newly born children of Bani Israel, because he saw in this dream and it was interpreted in such a way that someone from Bani Israel is born and he's going to take over your kingdom and so on. So he sent his soldiers to take the lives of all of the newly born babies among the people of Bani Israel, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved Musa alayhi salam, and not just saved him that his mother hid him under a bed or sent him somewhere or fled the country, but rather Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent Musa alayhi salam himself to Fir'aun, and he was raised in the palace of Fir'aun. And the ways of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is against the plot of those who plot against the orders of Allah. This is all part of understanding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muhaymen. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about Musa alayhi salam, وَلِتُصْنَعَ عَلَى عَيْنِي, for you to be made under the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we believe in all of the attributes of Allah, even though we would explain a verse one way or the other, but with the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whatever attribute is mentioned like eyes and so on, we believe in all of this. So the fact is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showed us this in the Quran very clearly, that your goal as a human being is to be obedient to Allah and leave the matters to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He will protect you. You are a slave of Allah. Your job is to be obedient to Allah. Ibrahim alayhi salam, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved him from the evil tyrant that tried to burn him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the fire, and the fire burns. The fire burns by itself. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created that in the fire, that it burns. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered the fire. And we do not say like some of the deviant beliefs, where they believe that the knife by itself does not cut. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in the knife at the moment of cutting the ability to cut. If you have heard this example before, or the fire does not burn by itself, but when it's burning something, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in the fire at that instant the ability to burn. If you heard that before, this is all wrong. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the fire, and the fire burns by the will of Allah. And the knife in itself is sharp and it cuts and so on. This is something that is very obvious, of course, as we know. But all of these things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, He subhanahu wa ta'ala has the will and the power to not to let it burn. And that's why He said to the fire, قُلْنَا نَارُ كُونِي بَرْدًا وَسَلَامًا عَلَى إِبْرَاهِيمَ. We said to the fire, be bardan, be cool, and salam and safe for Ibrahim. Because He's the creator of the fire, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is Al-Muhaymen. He's the one that is overseeing this. Things does not happen by itself like this. Everything is by the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything is by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how Ibrahim alayhi salam was saved by the power of Allah. When we look throughout the entire Quran, the stories of the messengers of Allah, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala aided them, how He gave them victory, how He destroyed the disbelievers, and how He oppressed them as a result of their disbelief. When we look into the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala changed the situation from one situation to the other. People, when they are living and they're seeing what they're seeing, they're not seeing the big picture, if it's correct to say. They're not seeing the power of Allah. But we get to know and to see that from the revelation, from the wahy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the same thing in our lives. Whether it's your individual life or the life of the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ, don't think that the matter is left like this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muhaymen. He's overseeing all of this. He's witnessing everything in your life. And everything happens by exact, specific measure based on the wisdom of Allah, and the knowledge of Allah, and the power of Allah. So rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and have the comfort, and be pleased with the qadr of Allah, and take the means, and focus on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you. Because you believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muhaymen. And nobody can oppose the power of Allah. Nobody can change the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We as slaves of Allah, we are obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us. And these are means to change what we do not know. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the owner, and He's the one that knows all things whatsoever. So, believing in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Al-Muhaymen, that would basically affect our actions. And that's what we need to discuss. How can the belief in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Al-Muhaymen? By the way, the root of this name is used with regards to the belt that a person would tie his waist with. Something that encompasses, goes around the person. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muhaymen. He oversees all of His creation. His knowledge encompasses everything. He is the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala. The book of Allah, being in that state, witnessing over what's previously in the revelations from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if that's with regards to the revelation from Allah, you can imagine then with the things that is not revelation from Allah. People sometimes, especially in the times that we live in, with the social media and things like that, there's a lot of fitan and trials, and that is, everybody is able to speak and express themselves and to write things. People write things and write statements, and they benefit from one another, and they quote from one another. And you'll find sometimes famous people, whether they are guided or misguided, they would every day or whatever, once in a while they would write a statement. They're trying to express their feelings or stating something they think this is the truth or whatever there is. And people might read and might think, some of them would say, this is great, makes sense, this is beautiful, this and that. But where is that has to do with the truth? Is it anything and everybody that can says anything, and people take it as if it's revelation from Allah? How that as we as Muslims, we should differentiate between what people are saying and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. We need to know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muhaymen. His words witnesses and overpowers all words and all statements. When someone would say, this means this or that, based on what? Is it based on what you saw in your dream? Or what you think because you're a smart person or whatever? Or it's based on facts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So therefore we need to humble ourselves to refer to the book of Allah, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned the book of Allah that it's muhayminan alay, that is oversees and witnesses over the previous books, which are books of Allah. The Torah and the Injil are books of Allah. We believe in the Torah and the Injil are books of Allah, and the Quran overtakes them, abrogates the message before with regards to the words of Allah. So then if it's not the words of Allah, that means min babi awla, that means it's even more important to believe this way. So how can we then live our life not according to this understanding and the benefit of knowing the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Many people, they don't pay attention to the effect of these names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our life. And therefore we need to reflect a little bit more, get to know how can that affect our life, how can that affect our belief and actions and so on. The name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Al-Muhaymen. And with your phone calls and participation also we can benefit inshallah ta'ala if you have any questions and the like of that. But we'll do that inshallah ta'ala after the break. So stay with us inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah. Wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Welcome back. And with the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Al-Muhaymen. This beautiful name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that how can it purify our hearts and how can it affect our hearts believing in it, and how to act in our life according to this name. After explaining the meaning of it, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala witnesses all things over all things, whether it's hidden or not hidden, He oversees all things subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also witnesses for the previous books, abrogates the previous books, and abrogates and oversees and witnesses over all statements for all human beings. Everybody can say whatever they want, but if it's against what's in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, that means it's wrong. And this is how the believers, and this is one of the benefits of learning about these names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is that we put things in the right perspective. The words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be like the words of other than Allah. The creator of the heavens and the earth, we should listen to the words of Him subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and to exalt this and to follow and to humble ourselves to this, and not to oppose that with so and so said, or people's opinion is this or that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muhaymen, is the one that His knowledge encompasses everything. And that's why one of the benefits to learn is that to always be witnessing and knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching us. Because He knows what is secret, what is hidden, and what's even more than that. We can deceive other human beings. People can praise us. People can see our speech and actions and they would say, MashaAllah, we're great individuals. We're honest, we're believers, we're this and that. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in our hearts. He knows what's hidden. We cannot hide anything from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if a believer believes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muhaymen, overseeing over all things, then he's going to be always watchful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Would teach us how to be mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be basically witnessing that our actions are not just actions and has nothing to do with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is witnessing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is witnessing, is seeing. And we will be punished or rewarded according to our actions and our intentions and what's in our hearts and so on. So this is a great benefit that we need to learn as a result. A purification of our hearts with being watchful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a result in believing in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Al-Muhaymen. Another thing is that when we think about it, when we reflect upon this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is overseeing all things. That means He knows what is right and what is wrong. He knows who is upright and who is corrupt, who's the righteous ones and who's the corrupted ones. He knows the liars and the truthful ones. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So therefore, we should have in our hearts this purification of our hearts by being pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Be pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because He knows best subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're taking the means to be the best and so on, and be pleased with the qadr of Allah. Whatever He decree for you, be pleased with it, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muhaymen. If a person is afflicted with sickness, he should not compare himself to someone that is healthy, and to say why that person is healthy and why am I sick. This by itself shows that the person is ignorant. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He afflicted someone with something, He is Al-Muhaymen. He's the one that is witnessing all things. He knows best. And therefore He wants something from you. For you to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by being pleased with whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala afflicted you with. And it's not necessarily a sign that you're an evil person or a good person, whatever, is according to our action of worship and obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because He knows best His creation. And the same thing, whether it's an individual or for the entire ummah, when people commit suicide or have this bad expectations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because they do not believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes. And as something that we need to always mention, nothing in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and nothing in this world is made in such a way that people might maybe, I'm not sure where do they get that from, that this life is not according to what we like and according to our desire and our will. It's according to the will of Allah. We are born this way, we depart from this life this way. Nobody is to be given more time, for example, because he wished to have more time. The same thing within what we witness in our life and so on. It's all by the will of Allah. You can wish and you can want whatever you want. You can plan whatever you plan, and there's nothing wrong with planning and so on. But if the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in such a way, then nobody can oppose this. How many people they planned for things to happen and it didn't happen. Because things are not according to our will, but according to the will of Allah. So living our life with this attitude, that means we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, when we have this contentment and to be pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is the most merciful and He is Al-Muhaymen. And therefore, seek your strength and power from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if you are with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are protected, because He's the one that overseeing all things. You know, when a child does not know what's beyond, his intellect is limited. And if a person knows that, if you are, for example, in a place that you don't know anything about it, and you fear for your life, and there are all kinds of things that can harm you severely, and someone there that he knows everything, and he is, in charge of everything, and he'll give you the comfort and the security. This is from human being to a human being. You have so much comfort, and you would even submit yourself to that individual. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the best example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala oversees all things, and He is the all-knower of all things. So therefore seek your strength. Be strong by being close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't seek strength from other than Allah. Don't let the sin be means of your strength. Many people, they commit sins because they think sins will give them strength. Because if they commit a sin, maybe they would make more money in an unlawful way. That will give them more wealth. That means they will have more strength. If they seek a status or whatever physical ability in a harm's way or in haram's way, they think that this will give them strength. This is all a result of not knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes. But rather seek your strength from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by being obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He's the owner of all things. And everything is under the witness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He knows best. If you want to raise your children, and raising your children is difficult for you, because the fitan and the trials are everywhere, and you find that you raise your children, you teach them all kinds of good things, and a bad friend will take them away in no time, and things of that nature, turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone and seek help from Him, because He's the one that is overseeing all things. Of course, while taking the means, but turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because as a fact of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us, human beings, they refer and they turn to the one that is stronger than them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most powerful. Nothing is more powerful than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He is Al-Muhaymen. Nobody do anything except by the power and the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also, one of the great benefits to learn when we talk about the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Muhaymen, especially when we talked about the Quran, that the Quran witnesses for all the previous books. That means we need to change the way that we deal with the book of Allah. The book of Allah, the words of Allah, this is the speech of Allah, takes over everything in our life. Don't make your speech and your opinion and your statements to yourself, or the speech of a wise person or someone that has knowledge or whatever there is, takes over the statements and the speech of Allah and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. These are facts. This is something that we should take with certainty, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His book overtakes all the previous books and all speech and actions and so on. So to believe in it. So it's better than all speech. It's nothing is the like of it, and therefore it should show in our actions. Otherwise we're not being truthful in what we say and what we do and so on. We need to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with all of these meanings, and then it would show its effects in our actions, in our obedience, in our dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in humbling ourselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how when we say the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and recite the Quran, how the Quran affects our life. And that's the details of this is an individual task that we need to take upon our own selves. And how the deen of Islam, I'm not sure if it's correct to say the word, but it's so dynamic that it always encourages to do things. We're constantly doing actions, but without paying attention to what's in our hearts, these actions can be of no benefit whatsoever. It can be even a source of punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have to be sincere. We have to seek rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. We have to have this, to be pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and to know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. Our daily prayers, the 5 daily salah, never to delay them, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is overseeing every action that we do. And what is more important than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you for? Is there anything more important than to pray the salah on its time? This is a question that we need to have the answer clearly, which is basically nothing is more important than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed for us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us to pray our salah in the beginning of its time. He wants the men to pray in the masajid. Why is it when we see this very sad scene, when people are invited to a concert or a soccer game or whatever there is, they fill the bleachers and the places and so on. It's filled with people. But then Salatul Fajr, when people are invited by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to come to the house of Allah, to pray, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sometimes some even masajid are not even opened in Fajr prayer. Or 2-3 people that are there. Where are the rest of the ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Where are the men of the ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? What's taken them away from the most important act in their day and night, which is the salah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to establish in every single specific time for the rest of our life. The effect of believing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muhaymen is that it will make us wake up for the Fajr salah and go to the masjid. And the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he said clearly in the hadith, لو يعلم الناس ما في الفجر ما في العتمة والفجر لأتوهما ولو حبوا. Or more or less meaning that if people know what's in the Fajr Salah and the Isha Salah, they will come to it even if they have to crawl on their faces. Why? If they know the rewards that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is preparing for them. And this is something that is a matter of unseen, and that's why to believe in the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is unseen to us, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muhaymen, overseeing. So how can you allow that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would see you sleeping at the time of the salah? Something that the early generations of Islam, they used to act according to this. They used to encourage one another, help one another to do good deeds because they believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes. They would go visit the sick. They would go pray the janazah. They would help the needy. They would feed the poor. And they would always be benefiting for others. They would seek knowledge and they would teach knowledge to others, and they would struggle and do all kinds of good deeds for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of their belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, and one of which the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muhaymen. It has this meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above all of His creation. And we can go on and on with the details of this, and we need to be like this. How is the Quran in our life? How are we learning the book of Allah? Many of us now are living at times where many people are intellectual and they're very well educated, and they spend years and years of their lives learning, and they're going to school and very intellectual. Where is the proportion of this in our life with regards to the deen of Allah, to the book of Allah, the Quran? How much of the Quran we know? We can say, and it's valid for a person to say, it's not mandatory for me to memorize the entire Quran. We're not talking about memorization only. Yes, it's not mandatory for you to memorize the entire Quran, but what is better in your life that you're spending your time in? Yes, mashallah, if people are working, earning, halal, and all of this is a rewardable thing and benefiting the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ. But giving time to the Quran, to reflect upon the verses of the Quran, reading something from the Quran every day, giving the attention to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to learn from it, to act according to it, based on the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muhaymen. He's witnessing what we're doing and what we're saying and so on. And if we go back again to the daily actions, Salatul Jumu'ah, for example, look at the masajid of the Muslimin. When the Imam would start the khutbah, the masjid is empty except for only a few places. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the time of the early generations of Islam, the scene was in such a way that in the early morning after Fajr Salah, people would go to the masajid for the Jumu'ah prayer. They did not say it's not mandatory. They did not say, well, as long as the Imam is not on the mimbar, on the pulpit, it's okay for us. They were not having this attitude. Their deen was the most important thing in their life. The thing that makes them move and sit and walk and eat and get married and all of these things is the deen of Allah, is the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Who would stand up for the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala nowadays when we're all talking about how the situations of the Muslims are? We have to change within our own selves first, and this is how we change, by believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes. And these verses of the Quran and how it was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, and how the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they took that in their lives and they acted according to it. What's the benefit of the stories of the messengers of Allah that are mentioned in the Quran? Why is it there? Is it for us to just to say these stories to our children and so on, or for us to change our life to be according to what we're listening, what we're hearing, and to rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone? And this is true for all kinds of deeds. And the same thing when it comes to the sins. The sins that is widespread among the Muslim Ummah, for example. The things that we see in the streets, in the among the Muslims and so on. Free mixing and people not observing the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it's with the relationship between men and women, and disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with regards to these relationships. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as the Prophet ﷺ said, Inna Allah yaghar. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have jealousy, and this is a perfect attribute of Allah, not the negative one that a human being would have. And the jealousy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is when the sins are being committed, when the zina, when the fornication, adultery is committed. This is something that we witness, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Muhaymen. He's overseeing all things and actions and so on. So to observe this chastity, to protect ourselves, to continue to observe the Islamic manners of things. We are not like others. We should not be like the entire world where everybody's the same. Everybody's free mixing, so we free mix. Women are not wearing hijab, men are doing this. This is not the life of a Muslim. A Muslim, he lower his gaze. The respect of the family, there's a husband and a wife. There are children that are raised in a healthy environment, that are lowering the gaze. All of these types of things that used to go to the east and the west, and you would find the Muslims observing these meanings. So what happened to us? The lack of understanding the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the adornment of this life with regards to all of these temptations, and having the weak iman and the deficiency in one's faith and iman that makes a person fall into these types of deficiencies. This is how the belief in the names and attributes of Allah should affect our lives. And we can go on and on with this. In our relationships, in our environments, in our cultures, in our behavior, in our beliefs, in every aspect of our life, we have to see the effect of the belief in the names and attributes of Allah in all of our affairs, in all of our actions, and this is how we should purify our hearts. So when we say the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Muhaymen, the one that oversees, the one that witnesses over all things, that the book of Allah we oversees and witness over all of the previous books, that we are in no need of any other previous book, we are in no need of any means of guidance except what's in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is how the believers, they would then have the proper belief in these names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to subject everything in our life to fit and to be in place with these meanings and with these attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why when the Quran, as we heard in the previous verses, about how when the Quran overpowers, oversees, witnesses over the previous books, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to be in haste, to do the good deeds, to race with one another to do the good deeds, because Allah is watching us, He's overseeing us, He knows who's honest and not, and who's truthful or not, and who's obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or not. And the excuses should not be, I'm not sure, what is this, what is that, but rather to learn and to act, and to seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the reality of this. This is how we need to really purify our hearts, to benefit from what we're saying and so on, is to go back to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, learn these great meanings of matters of belief, learn the names and attributes of Allah and how it's mentioned in the Quran, and act according to this. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify our hearts and to make us among those who are steadfast on the truth, and to protect our families and our children, and to make them steadfast and to make them chaste, and to be away from the ways of the disbelievers and the wrongdoers and so on. Until next time, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us all from all evil. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.